talk about keeping it safe and simple. And the idea around bring your own devices, it's not just a phenomenon and a four-letter acronym and a source of worry. It can also be something that you can actually do well at and be successful with. So I'm going to just talk about the formula as we see it and how we approach the topic from the standpoint of our customers. So first, but just a little bit about me. Nice smiley photo. We recently went through a rebrand, so I had to get the nice glossy photo, and there it is. I'm a CTO at a company. We're based in New York, but we have our engineering offices here in Boston. I work here out of Boston, right in the shadow of the clock tower downtown. I used to be an analyst at Forrester. Back in the day, some of the characters, and that's the right word, that used to work with me at AtStaker here, including Rob, introduced me, helped start the company with this group of folks, and wrote a book on security metrics. And probably relevant for the talk, last fall we launched a service for mobile device management, managed MDM, if you can say such a thing, trying to provide some services for customers. And just to give you a sense of our customer, we work with a lot of banks and credit unions. So we have about 2,000 banks that we work with, and many of them needed a mobile solution. So we wanted to bring something to market. And a part of the talk is really about what we've learned from going through that process of bringing that to market and trying to make a BYOD program work, particularly in stringent environments like a regulatory environment as in banking. So that's it. I'm going to do the abstract infomercial for the company, just so you know what we do. Silver Sky is, we're in business to help simplify how companies secure their most important information, and it's really through 3 service lines. Managed security services, so we monitor for intrusions 24/7. We have a SOC, 2 SOCs actually, one in Raleigh, one in Manila. We provide security software, so things like encryption, compliance archiving, and the like. And we have a managed service offering for email, other information, MDM, as I mentioned. So these 3 families of products help provide a total solution. We tend to work a lot in the mid-market. We do have a good complement of enterprise customers as well. So that's all I'm going to tell you about Silver Sky. I would love to refer you to the website if you want to learn more about it. So the first thing I want to just talk about is BYOD. And one of my colleagues at Forrester calls it the mess of many, which I think is a great phrase. And I'm going to describe some of this in texture and depth. You've probably read a lot about this in the press, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do want to provide some numbers and some trends that we're seeing around it. I'm then going to talk about how not to do BYOD, things that are dumb, that are going to get you in trouble, and are going to annoy your users and maybe get you in trouble with regulators or the law. So I'm going to tell you how not to do it, and then I'm going to go into the action plan, which is what you could do or what you should do, in my humble opinion. So there you go. Besides buy our services, which everybody should do anyway. But these are, as an ex-analyst, I have to crib analyst numbers. It's what we do. So I swiped some from Gartner, fiddled around with them a little bit, and came up with some conclusions around what the market is doing. And just the way to think about this is that mobile, these post-PC form factors, everything ranging from tablets to smartphones to e-readers, Kindles and so forth, are really taking over. If you look at just the numbers that are shipped, right around 2010 was where we were at rough equilibrium, where the number of traditional PCs that we know, workstations, laptops, and so forth, that run a PC-style operating system, a Unix, a Mac OS, a Windows, whatever, was about even with these post-PC devices. But you can see the projections are really quite steep in the post-PC direction. So our friends at Gartner tell us that about 1.4 billion of these non-PC devices are going to be shipped by 2015. So that's about 75% of devices sold. So, and these are all devices that have internet access, that have email, that have potentially an attack surface on them, and that are increasingly making their way into employees' pockets and into their purses and bags. So that's the big trend overall. These things are taking over. But the real important point is that the consumer brands are the ones that are driving the change. And certainly we see this with Android, with Google, with Symbian phones. All of the Apple devices are definitely consumer brands, whereas the traditional favorites, RIM, any Microsoft branded device, HP and so forth, is really a much slower trajectory. So, just to do the math, you look at what the analysts tell us, about 7 out of every 10 are going to be these these scary, unmanaged consumer devices and not your traditional IT favorites. RIM did a commercial a couple years ago that said amateur hour is over. It actually seems that amateur hour is continuing and is raging in full swing, and we're going to continue on this trajectory for quite a while now. So what is BYOD? It's basically allowing employees to bring their own gear to work and to use them to access company resources, particularly email. And the three things that are driving bring your own device it's really from above, from below, and from the corner office. So from above, you have executives. They want a little extra cachet. They want a little bling. They're bringing an iPad into the boardroom. From below, fashion, keeping current, people that are tired of their current devices. A little known fact, the capital budget for PCs is you typically depreciate over 3 years. The smartphone cycle time is 6 months, right? So if you think about that and compare the rate of change in the consumer arena with what your IT shops are typically used to budgeting, it means that by definition, 3/4 of the time, an employee is working with an obsolete device. And probably a lot of the time, they want something better. So this is what's driving it from below, is they just want to use what they want to use. And I think of these devices as like jewelry. You want to bring your own jewelry to work. Employers aren't issuing these things to employees anymore. And the CFO, of course, sees a desire to decrease telecom expenses. So if you look at what a BlackBerry plan might cost you, compare it with letting the employee pay for most or all of that, it presents a potentially tempting cost target. And the CFO says, well, maybe if we can make this whole security thing work, maybe this might make sense. We can cut some costs. You had a question back there. Yeah, I think the devices are definitely helping employees be more productive. If productive means sitting on the toilet at 11 o'clock at night answering an email, right? That's productivity for you, I guess. But there's lots of different types of productivity. You can do it in the email on an airplane, on a subway, or whatever. So I think that's definitely part of it. But I'm not sure it's the major driver, but it's definitely one. So yes, sir.
Making people work more is not added productivity, just making them work more.
I would agree with that. So you're right. You're talking about an aggregate throughput number as opposed to an efficiency argument. So you're right. We may not be increasing productivity, but we're definitely making people do more things and do them in more places. So, all right. So thank you for keeping me honest. Just a couple other pieces of market texture here around BYOD. How widespread is it? My former employer, Forrester, estimates that about 2/3 of enterprises allow employees to bring their own gear to work, but only about 4/10 of them, 39%, have an actual mobility plan about how they're going to deal with it. So in other words, a big percentage of companies are really just not dealing with this very well. And in my experience, most of the time when we talk about BYOD, we're talking about phones and tablets. We're not usually talking about PCs. Most of the time, the company-issued PC is still the thing that most employers are looking to hand out, and will increasingly be the case, I suspect. Financial services, I mentioned we do good business in financial services. You would think that as one of the more risk-averse categories, industries, that they would be a little less likely to do this. However, we've actually found that it hasn't been too different from many of our other customers. So we figure about 50% or so of our banking and credit union customers are all looking to do BYOD in some fashion. They either have a program, they're looking to put a program in place, and they want some help and guidance. So there you go. So that's a little bit of the background around BYOD in terms of how we look at it, how we define it, and the trends. I'm going to talk about how not to do it. And the worst thing, of course, to do is, and this may seem obvious, is not to have any kind of policy at all about it. If you believe that it's inevitable and you believe that it's coming and that we're dealing with it, the worst thing to do is to basically maintain the fiction that we're still buying BlackBerries for everybody and that we don't have to deal with these crazy Android devices. But everybody does, or will likely have to soon deal with them. And so the question is, you need to have a plan. So not having one is clearly a bad idea. And the reason why is simple. First, because there's lack of clarity around what devices should be allowed. If you have a plan, you can make that clear. You have muddy rights about company data. If you have a company phone and it accesses company email and there's personal email on it, Does the employee gain rights to the data on the phone? This is something that the attorneys that we talked to have posited could be the case in some examples. Do you lose the right to control the data if you don't have any kind of guidance on this? This is a potential issue. There may be unclear responsibilities for repair and data plans. Now, certainly with some of the more favorite consumer devices like the Apple devices, you got a problem, it's easy enough, you go to the Genius Bar. Less so the case in the Android example, but that may not be intuitively obvious to everybody who has one. There may be still an expectation that if you set up an email account by yourself and you mess it up, I'm not referring to anybody in this room because we're all quite savvy here, but just maybe people you might work with, they have some trouble and they expect to call the help desk. Do they have a right to ask for that support? And what does help desk do when they're dealing with a device that they don't know about? So these are issues to think about. Records of acceptance. One of the things that every company does, not every company, but most of them do, is they have an acceptable use policy that you typically look at and sign off on for general use of IT computing resources. So when you join a company, you read through the HR manual. There's usually a little form that says, here's the IT policy. I agree not to do the following things and to do the following things. But in the mobile case, there's a little more granularity and specificity. Oops, did I hit a button? There's a little more granularity around mobile devices. And, oh, I know what I did. I actually went to I put the cursor in the lower right-hand corner. Sorry about that, guys. All right, note to self, do not move cursor. Okay, so, but you may not have a record of, if you believe mobile is special and there are there's special care that you need to devote to your policies around it, if you don't actually have a sign-off on that newer, more revised policy, then that potentially could be a problem with HR. And of course, and the other final point about not having a policy is that you may find a case where you're lacking consistency. Let me give you an example. Mobile devices often have a tracking feature, GPS capabilities. If you, as a favor to the CEO, they lose their phone in a taxi cab after an important meeting, you decide to locate that phone for them, wipe it on their behalf, that's fine. Now you've established a precedent that you can locate devices and that you have that capability. And you may have to, if you're ever in a court action, you may have to show that you had the capability and didn't use it, or conversely, if you were inconsistent about how you do these things, the courts may determine that you've been inconsistent, and inconsistent in the eyes of the law is never good. So it's that lack of clarity around all of these issues that can really get you into trouble. Another how not to do BYOD is over-collecting personal data. One of the things that's been true with IT-owned assets, so if you have a laptop, it's managed by the company, you may have an asset management system. If you've got a BlackBerry, you're probably used to collecting a lot of information about the device, everything from telemetry, how it's functioning, to battery life, to memory usage, location. In a personally owned device situation, you may have the temptation to do those same things. But the challenge in a bring your own situation is that that is, number one, potentially perceived as problematic by your employees, who may not want you to have access to their call records, who may not want you to have access to their location, who may not want you to have access to their SMS, browsing habits, what have you. And this could be a symptom. You may decide that this is something you want to do because you've always done it this way with the BlackBerry. So generally a potentially bad idea. The first reasons this is a bad idea, everything you collect you have to protect. If you're collecting location information about your mobile devices, whether they're employer or employee-owned, you've got to figure out where to protect that information. If you're using an outsourced service, you have to make sure that service is secure. If you're doing it in-house, there are databases you have to protect. We all know about database problems here at this conference. And if you fail to protect it, you have to report it as spilled, essentially, to the regulators. The GPS data, call data, this is all personally identifying. The regulators tend to have an interest in this kind of thing. And it's the sort of thing that can get you into the press. One thing that we've learned over the last couple of years with location data is it's completely radioactive. 2 years ago, Apple had a little problem where it was caching Wi-Fi location information. Somebody figured this out. This went viral. Apple was called to Congress to talk about it. There was issues where an app maker named Path was secretly collecting information about location information and contacts, uploading it to servers and presumably using it all for beneficial purposes. But these are all things that show you how when you've got a real personal device like a phone that has this information, whether it's contacts, GPS information, call information, it's very sensitive. So, and then lastly, if you're looking to do some of these things, call tracking, location tracking, it tends to drain the device battery. Most of the time you need an agent to do it. It's not fun if your phone all of a sudden has 30% less battery capacity than it did the day before. So that's another how not to do BYOD. Another thing not to do is to treat all devices the same. So you may decide that you've always managed BlackBerries a certain way. You're going to manage all the personal devices the same way, and you refer to Android as a thing. Android is an operating system. There are many, many devices that run it, and Android is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get depending on the device. And so by lumping Android in the same category, for example, with iOS or with BlackBerry devices, you run the risk of conflating some of the security issues that may be present. So, and in particular, some mobile devices are better than others. BlackBerry, of course, still is the gold standard, highly secure. There are terrific, it's FIPS certified. It's been tested time and again against brute force attacks. Very manageable. iOS, for those of you who have experience with any of the mobile tools that Apple provides or that you can use with an MDM software, Apple devices have quite a bit of manageability built into them, everything from app management to device management, security policy pushing, all kinds of things. Also reasonably secure, plus or minus the occasional bootloader exploit and the occasional jailbreaking exploit, but pretty good. Android, much more limited manageability features. It supports ActiveSync. That's the primary strategy for managing it. If you're a Google Apps shop, you can also use Google Apps to manage the devices, but again, fairly limited. And in the Android case in particular, it's highly fragmented. So not a lot of capabilities in every area. Security features are very different. And a lot of proprietary enhancements. So Lenovo, 3LM, Samsung all have particular toolkits that they've added to their devices that give them a little extra edge on all those other Android vendors. But if you're looking to manage them, it's actually very, very hard to do. So when you talk about Android, it's not a monolith. It's really, you've got the highly secure part of the more secure part of the Samsung ecosystem. You've got the less secure part of the Samsung ecosystem. You've got the 3LM-powered devices, the Lenovo-powered devices, the cheap devices that have nothing on them. It just goes on and on. So it's quite hard to get your head around Android sometimes. So treating Android as a thing is not always the best idea. And then finally, older operating systems, depending on the device, have more or less features than others. So iOS 4 and 5, much better than version 3, which didn't have any data encryption features. Android, for example, didn't have any passcode complexity or device encryption features prior to version 3. And in the encryption area, even version 4, where it's supposedly required, it isn't implemented consistently across devices. So you don't know whether you're going to get hardware assist or not, depending on the make and model. So control freakery. I've kind of touched on this a little bit with the topic around data collection, but there are some other symptoms about how not to do BYOD by being control freakish about it. The first one, obviously, basically making blanket and unrealistic prohibitions against using these devices to do personal things while you're at work. We all know they're personal devices. People are going to tweet. People are going to check their Facebook at lunch. There's just, at a certain point, reality needs to enter the policy in terms of how you run the program. The other symptom of control freakery is requiring a complex password that resembles your desktop policy. So, 12 characters, change them every 30 days, make them complex, make them a pain in the neck, and make sure that you put that on the phone too, and then put a 5-minute timeout on the phone so that you have to enter it every 5 minutes. I have customers that have done this. One of the customers I have that uses our MDM service, we have a default security policy with a passcode which I'll talk about. And their security director said, we've got to have a policy that is a little more complex. And they actually went with a 10-character passcode with 2 special characters, upper and lowercase, and it expires every 30 days. And this is all of their mobile devices are required to use this. And it has an automatic wipe setting on it. So, 10 wrong tries and the device blows up. Highly secure. Highly pain in the ass, too. So, yes, sir.
So 24 hours after they implement that policy and they remove it for the CEO, the CFO, the security director,
Yep.
Does that make them inconsistent in their application of policy that you mentioned earlier?
Indeed, it does. So I suspect once they're piloting it, this particular customer is piloting it right now. Once they roll it out, I suspect they're probably going to have to make some adjustments. But the reflex, this was the reflex. So, yes, sir. Yeah, right. You just don't enroll your device. So that's how you do it. Yes, sir.
Do you know if anybody's actually ever studied in the context of a mobile device whether this kind of business, 12-character, 10-character, actually provides any additional security over a potential candidate? 10 trials.
Sort of. I mean, there have been, you've seen Cormac Hurley's work at Microsoft around password aging policies. I think Ross Anderson.
I'm thinking specifically of phone where you
Yeah.
10 tries or 12.
Yeah, I was gonna answer your question piecemeal, right? So I think the aging part of it has been covered in a couple places. We've done a little bit of research on this, but not empirical, more of the entropy-related math variety, to suggest that we can get similar entropies with shorter lengths and a auto-destruct policy, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. But I haven't seen any. Is anybody aware of any work in this area? Where anybody's really looked at this? Whether a PIN is better than a complex password?
Well, a PIN is just as good.
Yeah. My view is it can be just as good, which we'll talk about. So, anyway, so the gentleman in the back seat has anticipated one of the objections here about why this is a bad idea for using your crazy desktop policy. You're going to make exceptions, execs, right? And personal devices aren't company owned. You can't really do the same thing that you're doing, and the costs aren't all yours. So in some ways, you're imposing costs on employees when they're already bearing part of it already. Yeah.
Wow,
Yep. So this customer is putting that policy on personal devices. I wouldn't want to work there.
How are they finding out that somebody has a phone there? Are they searching them at the door?
So the answer is most of the time you have a choke point with ActiveSync. So you generally have some visibility into what devices are connecting because everybody wants their email, and so that's generally what you do. Yeah. So you use that as a way to figure out who's connecting, and then you can tap them on the shoulder and get them to enroll their devices, or remain ignorant and not do that, which is probably what will happen with this customer for a couple months anyway. Yeah.
Just to clarify, even with some more regulated clients, a personal device that isn't connected to the network, that isn't downloading emails, that don't care.
Most of the time, you're right. I mean, most of the time the customer only really cares if it's touching. I mean, they care about whether it's accessing SharePoint or some other information resource, but the killer is email. So if certainly we have had a couple customers say, if it's not touching email, I actually don't care about it. But most of the time they care. It's when it crosses that threshold and you're actually doing email is really where it matters. One of the more interesting things in the industry actually is that there's a cottage industry of vendors that do these ActiveSync gateways that essentially interpose themselves between the mail server and the device and attempt to do various security checks on them. A couple independent companies, and almost all the MDM vendors are employing some kind of security gateway in front of the ActiveSync server, or the CAS server actually, if you want to be technical about it, to try and do this. Oh, I did it again. All right. No shoulder surfing, please. Okay. Speaking of ActiveSync, Many companies do think, well, you know, I've got this server, and let's face it, most of the devices are ActiveSync capable, the Android, the iOS devices, the Windows Phone, and so I could just use the controls in Exchange to implement some decent security policies, and I don't need to do anything else. This is generally a bad idea because the spec isn't implemented very consistently. Depending on the vendor, it really varies. So iOS, for example, pretty good support. I think they're up to like ActiveSync version 14, and I think they implement most of the policies. There's something like 40-something different policy directives that they will handle. Windows Mobile, obviously, is pretty good, coming from Microsoft. Android is pretty bad. There's only about 8 ActiveSync policies that it supports, primarily some basics around passwords and the device wipe, and that's basically it. So if you want to do anything else, that's about it. And the other thing about ActiveSync is it's really kind of a least common denominator. So you don't get a lot of device-specific controls as part of it. You're going to get things that pertain mostly to email and around the entire device, like passwords, but that's about it. The other thing about ActiveSync is a really, particularly around device wipe, is a really blunt instrument. You basically you can melt the phone and destroy everything on the phone by resetting it to factory defaults. But that's not often realistic in a personally owned situation because the devices have things on it other than company data. And so one of the top requests we get from our customers, even the banks, is can you do a partial device wipe? Can you remove email and my company data and leave the personal stuff intact? Yeah, right, exactly. So, you know, Rob's wedding photos, for example, we want to leave those on the phone. We don't want those to vanish if he happens to make the wrong left turn out the door one day after a bad day at the office. So we want to preserve that partial wipe option. And so if all you're doing is ActiveSync, you don't get that. So, yes, John.
As nice as only partially wiping Rob's phone would be, is there any regulatory obligation of the company, or if they can convince Rob to sign a policy that says we can score earth your phone, is the company will do it?
Yeah, so a lot of this comes down to the agreement that you strike with the employee. The guidance we give customers, and I have in the how to do BYOD part, the third half of the show, as they say on Car Talk, I'll walk you through that. But what it comes down to is you want to preserve the right to completely wipe the phone if you have to, with the clear hint that you're not going to do it very often. And most of the time, what you're going to do is leave a little crater where the company data was and leave the rest of the phone intact. So, and if you can spell that out in the agreement, then that's the right way to do. So both parties know what they're getting into here. Yeah, Patrick.
So, how many people, in response to a policy like that, say, "That's fine, give me a phone"?
Well, that's always the other option, right?
Yeah, it sort of totally defeats the CFO's whole purpose in all this.
Yep. Yep. But most of the time, the employee will just say, "We'll do it." So, okay. So that's how not to do it. I hope that some of these are kind of tired stereotypes. So I apologize for essentially aiming at soft targets in the second half here. But in the third half, let's talk about about how to do this. So this just as kind of a simple schematic about how we view things, right? So the formula for success, to me, is dead simple, right? You've got, whoops, let me do this as a build. The first part is you've got to have some technology support. And I'm a firm, I mean, yes, we offer an MDM service. I'm not here to advertise that per se, but just that I actually do think it's a great weapon in your quiver. And let's face it, if you're deploying BlackBerry devices, you have a BES server, right? Nobody would suggest you deploy BlackBerry devices without it. And the same is true, you know, the equivalent in the ActiveSync-driven bring your own world is MDM. So to me, this is an essential tool in your quiver, and you need to have it. It helps you implement the rules that you set forth, at least from a technology standpoint, and that's part of it. The MDM platform itself is implementing your policy, and your policy is driven by two things. It's driven by your risk tolerance. So what are you willing to give up? What policies you're willing to set based on the risks you're willing to take. The classic case, for example, is password strength versus risk tolerance around breaking, for example. Do you want to have a password policy so strong that your device will be able to withstand a 32 GPU cluster that's running for 30 days? Okay, that's one policy. Are you worried about protecting against a lunchtime attack? In which case, you need a much shorter passcode. So these are the kinds of things that you think about. Best practices, of course, factor into this as well. So these two things drive the policy. But there's a third actor here, which is the law. And the law informs your policy. It limits what you can do in many cases. This is often the missing link when companies set these up. And it also limits what you can do with the technology. And I've sort of picked on the GPS location features that some of these packages offer a little bit. But this is one of those key examples where you need to think about this, particularly if you're in a company that is doing business overseas. If you have a subsidiary in Europe or European employees, for example, you may want to think very carefully about what you choose to do with your technology as you seek to manage these devices. And so our view is if you don't have these three elements, technology, policy, and law, and have them work together in a collaborative fashion, you're not going to make these programs work. So let's start with a couple key parts of the program. The first is what I refer to as a BYOD compact, and I mean this in the same way that the Pilgrims meant the Mayflower Compact, right? This is the kind of thing that multiple parties enter into, and they agree that they're going to, pledge their, I'm messing with my documents, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to safeguard this. But it's the kind of thing where you have multiple parties that are agreeing on joint obligations about what you're doing. And the hallmark here is that you're trading off some access to resources that the employee wants to get to something like email, and they're going to trade off some control. So they're going to give up a little bit of control in exchange for a little bit of flexibility and access. And there are a couple elements to this. First, the products that you can see on the market will support this, but having a formal electronic workflow, a click-through, if you will, where an employee that's enrolling a device to access company resources has to read through essentially a click-through agreement, read it, understand it, click through it, agree to it, and that you record it in a place that your HR team can get to it and can see it. And what this requires is a formal electronic acceptance of an acceptable use policy, otherwise known as the compact, when they enroll the devices. You can essentially interpose this in between them and their email the first time they try to enroll the device. And the AUP, simply put, defines your rights as an employer or in our cases as individuals, as employees. The kinds of things that you tend to put in here is you want to talk about the employer's responsibilities to monitor the device and the data on it, exactly what you're collecting and not collecting, usernames or not, applications or not, locations features or not, call records or not, support obligations. If it's an employee-owned device, are they left to their own devices, so to speak, if it breaks? The right answer is probably yes. But some employees may have different stances on this. They may want to build a center of excellence around iPads, for example, because they're passing it out to their product teams. These are all individual discussions that one can have. Confiscation. If the company is involved in a investigation and a law enforcement action, a subpoena, for example, or a criminal investigation, the company should formally reserve the right to confiscate the device, and the employee should agree to turn it over in the case where that's required. And this is something that we always recommend that companies include in their compacts. Yes, sir, in the back.
My understanding of contract law, based on TV, is all contracts have to be fair to both parties and give both parties something.
Yep.
And all of this seems very one-sided, in which it gives the company 100% of the value and the employee 0, which seems to violate that fairness of contract. And the second item is duress, where signing a contract under duress often is not a good thing.
Correct.
And obviously, sign this or we fire you seems like duress to me.
Yeah. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I mean, I think it can be, let me put it this way. depending on the situation, it may be come across that way. However, you know, the recommendation we have is that you should always have the option of a company-provided device. Always. And that's essentially, you always have that option. The company will pay for it. They'll support you. But don't forget, if you have a company-owned device, the company has all these rights anyway. You just don't have to, you're just not explicitly agreeing to it. You're tacitly agreeing to it. But I do understand what you're saying. I mean, and there's a lot of subtleties here. One of the things we did, and I don't want to, well, I'll talk about it a little. We work with one of the things we did when we set up our service was we set up we created a model acceptable use policy, and we worked with a privacy attorney called Proskauer. Anybody know them? They're one of the better privacy focused law firm. Well, they have many practices, but they have a great technology law practice. And so we basically, I asked the partner there to basically build a policy that that an employee might be able to live with, but also protects company rights. And so the things we're talking about here, the fact that, you know, the explicit inclusion of a company option is actually in that policy. And there's limiting language as well about what's collected and not. So, for example, in the model policy that we had them write for us and that we offer to customers for free as a value add, that they can use themselves, because we're not lawyers, we don't do legal advice, but we offer this as a template for them. We also sharply limit the information we collect with the service. So, for example, we don't collect GPS information because we expect that that's trouble. And so we've turned it off. Customers can't turn it on. And even though they've asked, we've told them they can't. So there's no technical capability for them to do that. And it's actually enumerated in that policy that says we collect the following information, and it's like 5 things. You know, the device ID, the username, who you are. We don't collect these other things. And so, you know, I'm a big believer in fairness on this, and I think this is important. On the other hand, you've also got to protect company rights. And so the question is, the difference with an employee-owned situation and employer-owned device is that it's much more transparent. You have to be. At least that's our recommendation on this. So there's no right answer to it. But on the other hand, I'm a guy who believes in being upfront about it. And if you're upfront, somebody can read it. If it's written in English, if it's not 100 pages long, they're much more likely to say, "Yeah, I get it. I get it."
This stuff is also new. I mean, I think we can agree about that, these policies. Although this just says, any of this stuff, to your knowledge, been tested before? One of my little hobbies is to watch some of the law blogs, and there are pieces of this that have been tested in various ways. There was a court case a couple years ago in Cleveland, I think, about company-owned, personally owned email that was used to transact company business, and there was a question about whether the courts could reasonably, whether there could be a subpoena issued and whether that information could actually be used in court, and it was upheld. So there are pieces of this that have been tried. I don't think the whole thing, similar to your question about password policies, I don't think the whole thing has been looked at as a whole. But we're gonna see this. I mean, we have a position on this, right? Which is you've got to be clear about all these items: erasure, reimbursement, termination, all that stuff. But our position is to do as little of it as possible, because it future-proofs. Actually, let me skip ahead. Let me skip ahead to a couple slides here, because I think this is an important topic. Yeah. So I'll skip back to the other things here. Our view on data collection is that you shouldn't collect what you don't need. It's similar to minimizing privileges on an operating system. If you minimize your data collection, you future-proof some of your ability to comply with regulations and laws. So on this front, you know, one of the ways that we have tried to get our clients out of potential jeopardy, legal jeopardy, is to really limit what we do. So like a lot of the MDM products will have these geofencing capabilities. They advertise it where they'll give this fanciful example of, imagine you're in a hospital and you have medical records on your iPad. Wouldn't it be nice if the minute you walk out of the hospital that information erases itself?
And these are the kinds of examples that they use to advertise geofencing. It sounds great, but it implies a capability of continual communication and obviously continually collecting it and then having to protect it and do something with it, which creates potentially a legal obligation to disclose it at a later date if you're ever in court, right? So the way we get around that is we just turn off the feature. So, like with IP address?
Yeah, just depending on where you're connected.
You could definitely do that, I think, in a lot of locations. But if you're looking at like a wireless iPad, then you might or might not.
A lot of the companies that I know have internal repeaters that they've set up for it, and they can do it
Yep.
based off of that.
Yep. Yep. I agree.
External problem.
I agree that there's a lot of different ways to look at this. In our case, we chose to just cut out an entire category by limiting it, right? So, in our view, if you eliminate location data, for example, if you get rid of call tracking, if you get rid of the only thing we left was data roaming, because that's sometimes interesting for telecom expense management. Like, we know if you're roaming, and that's about the only thing we know. But our position is you can't be sued over data you're not collecting, right? So that's kind of how we view it. Same on things like app purchases. A lot of the technologies you can peer inside the device. You can see what apps are on it. That's interesting to a point. It's interesting on company-owned devices. It shouldn't be interesting on employee-owned devices. You should only really know about the devices you've provisioned, apps you've provisioned for them. You don't need to know that Rob here plays Angry Birds or that it's on his computer. So again, we've turned that off too. So that's our view on it, is to just minimize your data collection. I've mentioned MDM. I think it's a tool in the bag. I think most of you know what it does. Configures the device. You can put things like wireless configs on it. You can wire it up for your email. You can put your security policy on it, implement your password. You can then use it to do all the remote control kinds of things that we've talked about. The other thing that the MDM products have, and I mentioned this, is that most of them have some kind of choke point gateway that's put in front of ActiveSync, and this is a nice component as well. So we recommend that. Most of the products put agents on the device. This is less needed in the Apple case because there's essentially an agent on the iOS, but you definitely need it for most of the other operating systems. So most of the time when you use MDM, you're going to be putting an agent on it. Okay, and then let's touch on Android. I mentioned before that if you're going to look at a BYOD program, you're going to be encountering Android. On our service, about 20% of the devices that we see of the ActiveSync variety are Android. About 80% of their Apple devices, weirdly enough. And so Android hasn't quite made it into the mainstream in terms of corporate usage, but we know that it's going to be. And so because of the box of chocolates problem with the security profile on the various flavors, makes, and models, we've chosen to recommend that one of your key practices could be to essentially retrofit Android with something that does have decent controls on it. So most of you probably know about good technology. It's a medieval torture device for mobile users. Anybody use it? Okay. Yeah, so pretty strange product, but everybody knows what it does, right? It's a container, it's a monolithic app, it has these work-alike versions of mail, calendars, contacts, and tasks. There are flavors of this that you can do on Android. One of the ones that we like is made by a company called NitroDesk. It's an app called Touchdown. It's essentially an ActiveSync client that includes mail, calendar, contacts, and tasks in it, and it essentially obeys MDM instructions. So in that regard, it does mean that we do have at least some kind of perimeter, so to speak, around the data that we can manage, that we know has a particular encryption profile around it, that we know is implementing our policies correctly. So that's essentially how we flatten the landscape on the Android side, and that's something that customers have asked about being able to do. Now there are some devices that are capable, or at least have more controls on. Samsung has a product line called Safe. The Galaxy S3 was the first device that had these controls on it. Galaxy S4 does as well. I think one of the Galaxy Note products does too. And has more management hooks in it for the MDM product. So in that case, if a customer has those, they're not required to use the NitroDesk client. You can still provide a little more control on it. So the watchword here is, with all the issues that Android has and not having a consistent baseline for control, we recommend that at least you apply some compensating controls, in this case a retrofit. There is a touchdown product for Apple. I don't know how well it works. If you're in the market for managing the product, I mean, the Apple, if you like the Apple Mail client, then you can use it and you can manage the product with an MDM solution and do pretty well with it. If you don't like the Apple Mail client and you want something a little different, then obviously you could use the touchdown client as well. See if I've got anything that I've missed here. So that's some of the cores. I wanted to come back to the password topic that Patrick had a question about earlier. I mentioned that the wrong thing to do with BYOD is to have a long, complicated, gnarly password that's like your desktop. The right thing to do is to have a short one. And I like pins because you can, not that I would ever do this, but in theory I could do this while I was driving. It passes the one-handed test, and I think that's, from a usability standpoint, that's a good benchmark, is can you do it with one hand while you're walking, not driving. And so pins are nice. On iOS, if you use a pin as opposed to a complex password, it actually knows this and will present a numeric keypad rather than the full keypad. So pins are nice. 5 or 6 digits combined with an automatic wipe policy is a pretty decent one. We chose to engineer the base policy that we have in our service. 5 or 6 digits, depending on the platform. Android has 6. All the other platforms have 5, with an automatic wipe after 10 wrong tries. So you don't do it after 10 tries, then the device erases itself. We don't have an expiration on it. I don't believe in expiration of passwords. I don't know if anybody agrees with me on this topic. But I'm a big believer in muscle memory. These devices this isn't your network password. So essentially all you're protecting is the device and not your email. So 5 minutes, right? Okay. So keeping it nice and simple is good. If you use a grace period, you can make this even easier. You can essentially do some stuff, put it in your pocket, realize you forgot to do some other stuff, take it out, and still unlock it without having to key in your PIN. So very nice. We based, if you do these things, you get to roughly, depending on how much you believe NIST password entropy estimates, you get to roughly about 2 to the 10th or 1 in 1,000 odds of being able to guess the passcode lifetime with a 5 or 6 digit PIN. This is good enough for NIST 863 level 1, which means we can defend it with the regulators, which is what our customers like. So that's essentially the approach we've taken. You can go for longer passwords too, but this is not a bad baseline if you want to at least start with something that's reasonably simple and somewhat humane. Okay, so what's next? I'm going to just, I don't have any conclusions or final recommendations, but just to say that other frontiers for BYOD, things that are on my mind right now, are some of these topics, right? So next frontiers for, if I come back, if they'll have me next year and I come back with, what we've been up to, these are some of the things that I expect we'll be able to talk a little bit more about. The lightweight containers for Android, very interesting topic. The NitroDesk is one of them. Content lockers, being able to divert attachments out of your email and to put them into something cryptographically protected could well be a nice control that we see more of in the next year. Android Total, I don't know if anybody saw the press release on this yesterday. It's sort of a virus Total, but for Android. You basically upload these APK files and it tells you whether it's been previously owned, which is pretty nice. Samsung Knox, nice data protection press release anyway, around some app-level data protection, something that I'm going to be looking at. And of course, all the Android platform security research. There's been a lot of work on Apple. I haven't seen as much on Android. It's going to be interesting to see the different flavors of attacks and compromises on some of the Samsung platforms and some of the leading Android platforms. So that's all I had. I mean, there's been good interaction. I hope this gives you a sense of how we look at BYOD, how to manage it, how to at least make it a little more tractable. This is an early frontier. We're going to see more of this tested in court. But if you got any questions, come bug me after. But thanks for coming. So.